At 4:03 in the morning, under a low Black Sea fog that Russian engineers had relied on as natural concealment for nearly 3 years, the underwater supports of the Kerch Strait bridge stopped behaving like a bridge and started behaving like a wound. Not metaphorically, literally. 1,100 kilograms of TNT equivalent, placed by Ukrainian security service divers against the submerged piers, detonated at the waterline of Russia's most symbolically protected piece of infrastructure. The shockwave did not just crack concrete. It cracked an assumption that Vladimir Putin has personally invested more political capital into than almost any other military fact in this war. The idea that the bridge to Crimea is permanent, that the peninsula is annexed, that the land beneath it is Russian, and that the army standing on it can be sustained indefinitely. What you are witnessing right now is not a story about a bridge. It is not a story about another spectacular Ukrainian strike. It is a case study in the slow, deliberate, methodical strangulation of an entire Russian field army, and the moment that strangulation crossed the threshold from possible to irreversible. Let that sink in, because the bridge is only the visible part of the operation. The invisible part is what has been happening to every other lifeline into Crimea for the last 18 months. And once you see the full picture, you will understand why I am telling you, with the certainty of someone who has spent decades studying how armies move, supply, and die, that Putin's Crimea group of forces, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 troops, depending on the count you trust, is extinguer and dakshin is dexti is now a stranded army. Not encircled in the classical sense, stranded, which in modern warfare is worse. Pull the lens back. Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened over the Kerch Strait, but why it was always going to happen, why every Russian engineering decision since 2014 prepared the ground for exactly this collapse, and why the next phase of this war is going to be defined less by frontline maneuver and more by the quiet terminal arithmetic of fuel, ammunition, and rolling stock that can no longer cross water. Rewind to 2014. When Russia seized Crimea, the strategic problem was immediate and obvious to any officer who could read a map. The peninsula is a near island. It is connected to mainland Ukraine by a narrow isthmus at Perekop, and to Russia proper by nothing at all except the Kerch Strait, which at its narrowest point is roughly 5 kilometers of cold, shallow, treacherous water. For 2,000 years, every army that has ever held Crimea has had to solve the same logistical riddle. How do you feed a peninsula that does not feed itself? The Soviets solved it with a ferry system and an electrical grid wired through southern Ukraine. When Ukraine cut both in 2015 and 2017, Russia faced a problem its propaganda could not paper over. Crimea was annexed on the map and starving in reality. So Putin built the bridge. 19 kilometers of road and rail, finished in 2018 and 2019, opened with Putin personally driving a truck across it for the cameras. It was never just infrastructure. It was a political artery. It was the physical manifestation of the claim that Crimea is Russian. And here is where Russian doctrine made its first compounding mistake. It assumed that a single, fixed, immobile, photographable piece of concrete and steel could carry the logistical weight of an entire occupation army indefinitely in a war environment where the other side would inevitably acquire precision strike capability. That was not a tactical mistake. It was a doctrinal mistake. It was the mistake of a military culture that still thought in terms of 1980s deep operations where strategic infrastructure could be defended by air defense bubbles and political deterrence. They built a target and called it a lifeline. By the time Ukraine struck the bridge for the first time in October 2022 with a truck bomb that collapsed 2 road sections and burned out a rail span, Russian planners should have understood the problem they had created. They did not. They repaired the bridge. They tightened security. They added underwater barriers, sonar arrays, smoke generators, and patrol boats. And in July 2023, Ukraine hit it again with surface drones. They repaired it again. And in June 2025, the SBU executed a third attack, the underwater strike I opened this analysis with, and Russia repaired it again, reopening traffic within hours and broadcasting the repair as if the speed of the patch erased the meaning of the wound. It did not, because the meaning was never the whole. The meaning was the fact that the bridge was now demonstrably a target Ukraine could reach at will from above, from the surface, and from beneath. And it gets even more serious from here. Because while the world's cameras were focused on the bridge, Ukraine was systematically dismantling every alternative. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. To supply an army of roughly 80,000 men in Crimea, with armor, artillery, air defense, and a partial naval base infrastructure, Russia needs to move somewhere in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 tons of material per day. That is fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, replacement vehicles, and rotational personnel. There are only three ways that tonnage can physically arrive. 1. The Kerch Bridge itself with its road and rail spans. 2. The so-called land bridge, the rail and road corridor that runs through occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, hugging the Sea of Azov coast through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol. 3. Maritime shipping across the Black Sea or Sea of Azov, primarily through Novorossiysk and the eastern Azov ports. Now look at what has happened to each of those three arteries. The land bridge, or the rail line through occupied southern Ukraine, has been under sustained Ukrainian deep strike pressure for over a year. ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Neptune, and increasingly long-range domestically produced drones have hit rail junctions, marshalling yards, locomotive depots, and fuel storage at Jankoy, Bakhchisarai, Melitopol, and at the Kamenolomny rail junction in Rostov Oblast, which Ukrainian drones struck in July 2025, specifically because it is the choke point through which mainland rail traffic must funnel before crossing into the occupied territories. The land bridge is not severed, but it is bleeding. Throughput has fallen. Repair crews live on the line. Russian rail troops are now suffering casualties from drones at a rate that no peacetime logistics force was ever designed to absorb. Maritime resupply has fared worse. Pull the lens back to the Black Sea Fleet. By March 2024, the British Ministry of Defense formally assessed the Russian Black Sea Fleet as functionally inactive. By mid-2024, Russia had withdrawn the bulk of its surviving warships from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland coast. Think about what that sentence means. The fleet that was the entire strategic justification for annexing Crimea in the first place has been chased out of Crimea by a country that does not possess a navy. That has never happened before in modern military history. Sevastopol, once the crown jewel of Russian naval power, is now a base that the Russian Navy is afraid to base ships in. The harbor still exists. The piers still exist. The dry docks still exist. What does not exist is the confidence that a warship moored there will be afloat in the morning. And that loss of naval dominance had a second-order effect that almost no mainstream coverage has properly grasped. Once the fleet retreated, the maritime resupply route to Crimea became a route under contestation rather than a route under control. Russian transport vessels, ferries, and tankers now move with the constant possibility of being struck by Magura and Sea Baby surface drones, by air-launched cruise missiles, by aerial drones at terminal phase. The ferry capacity that Russia rebuilt after each Kerch Bridge strike, those large ro-ro ferries that were supposed to substitute for the bridge during repair periods, Kurdi, Momsin. Those ferries are themselves now targets. Ukraine has struck them. Russia has lost them. The substitution does not work when the substitute is also vulnerable. This is the hidden military variable that mainstream framing misses every single time. When journalists ask whether the Kerch Bridge has been destroyed, they are asking the wrong question. The bridge is a node in a system. The system has 3 nodes. All 3 nodes are now under continuous Ukrainian fire. The question is not whether any single node has collapsed. The question is whether the system, as an integrated logistical organism, can still deliver enough tonnage to sustain combat operations across Crimea at the tempo Russia requires. And the honest professional answer, the answer that any logistics officer trained in any serious army will give you if you press them, is that the system is now operating below the threshold of sustained combat sufficiency. It has not collapsed. It is degraded to the point where Russia can hold Crimea in peacetime, but cannot fight a serious war from it. And here is where this matters enormously, because Russia is fighting a serious war from it. Let me push the analysis further. Crimea is not just a piece of occupied land. It is the rear area logistical base for the entire southern Russian front in this war. The artillery shells that fall on Ukrainian positions in Zaporizhia, the cruise missiles that fly out of the peninsula's airfields, the Iskander systems that hunt Ukrainian cities, the S-400 batteries that contest Ukrainian airspace, Latinki este, Investi, and Noaim, Embrisi, Ainspe. All of that is sustained by Crimean depots, Crimean rail yards, Crimean fuel storage, and Crimean repair facilities. When you degrade the throughput into Crimea, you do not just isolate the 80,000 troops on the peninsula. You silently degrade every Russian fire mission that originates from the peninsula. The bridge is not a Crimean problem. It is a Southern Front problem. And as the Southern Front degrades, Ukrainian operational options expand in exactly the direction Russia cannot afford, toward Melitopol, toward the Azov coast, toward the cutting of the land bridge itself. This is the doctrine of compounding logistics failure, and it is something the Russian General Staff has consistently failed to model. I want to be very precise about this because it is the prosecutorial heart of this entire analysis. Russian operational culture is built around massive fires, massive armor, massive men. It is not built around resilient distributed logistics. It never has been. The Soviet system that Russia inherited assumed that fixed rail lines, fixed depots, and fixed bridges would always exist in the rear because the rear was, by definition, the place where the enemy could not reach. The entire Russian way of war collapses the moment the rear ceases to be a sanctuary. And in this war, beginning roughly with the HIMARS arrival in mid-2022 and accelerating with every generation of long-range Ukrainian systems since, the rear has ceased to be a sanctuary. Russian planners have responded by moving depots farther east, by hardening shelters, by dispersing fuel. None of that addresses the underlying problem, which is that the Russian army was designed to fight forward with a guaranteed rear, and there is no longer a guaranteed rear anywhere within Ukrainian reach. That reach is now well past 1,000 kilometers. Pull the lens back further. What does industrial collapse look like in this context? It looks like a Russian railway ministry that has admitted publicly to locomotive shortages because Ukrainian drones keep destroying them. It looks like the catastrophic gasoline crisis that has hit occupied Crimea repeatedly through 2025 with mile-long queues at Sevastopol stations and the Regional Occupation Administration rationing fuel by license plate. It looks like a Black Sea fleet headquartered in a port, Vavastri Amnain Saikshi, Wine Sengshi, Wine, Novorossiysk, that Ukraine has now also struck with surface drones and aerial systems, meaning the relocated fleet is not safe in its new home either. It looks like a Russian Air Force that has lost roughly one-third of its strategic bomber fleet to deep strike operations, including the Operation Spider's web strikes of June 2025 that hit air bases as deep inside Russia as Olenya in the Arctic and Belaya in Siberia, more than 4,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Let that geography sink in. 4,000 kilometers. The country that was supposed to dominate Ukraine in 72 hours 3 years ago is now losing strategic bombers in eastern Siberia to drones that were assembled in Ukrainian workshops and smuggled inside Russia in wooden crates on civilian trucks. If that is not the definition of a structurally defeated military doctrine, I do not know what is. Now, with all of that as background, return to the bridge. Return to those underwater charges. Return to the SBU divers who placed 1,100 kilograms of explosive against the submerged piers and crawled out before dawn. Return to the moment that Putin understood, and he did understand, even if he will not say it, that there is no engineering solution to this problem. You can repair concrete. You cannot repair the strategic situation in which your enemy can reach your most symbolically protected infrastructure at the time and method of their choosing. You cannot repair the loss of deterrence. And here is the climactic operational point. Every previous Kerch Bridge strike was a single vector attack. October 2022 was a truck bomb above the surface. July 2023 was surface drones. June 2025 was underwater divers. Each one taught Ukraine something. Each one taught Russia nothing it could act on because the political requirement to preserve the bridge as a symbol overrode every reasonable engineering recommendation to relocate logistics elsewhere. The Russian government is now trapped by its own propaganda. It cannot abandon the bridge as a logistical asset without admitting that the bridge as a symbol has failed. So it keeps repairing it. So it keeps presenting a stationary, predictable, photographable target. So it keeps inviting the next strike, and the next strike will come. Not because I am making a prediction, but because the operational logic of this war makes it inevitable. The bridge has become a tax that Russia pays for refusing to acknowledge reality. What happens next changes everything. Because Ukraine does not need to drop the bridge into the Kerch Strait to win the logistical campaign. That is the framing trap that mainstream media has fallen into for 3 years. The Kerch Bridge does not need to fall. The Kerch Bridge needs to be unreliable. It needs to be the kind of asset where every shipment crossing it is uncertain to arrive, where every train is a potential casualty, where Russian fuel planners have to assume a discount factor on every projected delivery. That is what is already happening. The bridge is technically open. The bridge is operationally unreliable. The army it serves is technically supplied. The army it serves is operationally degraded. The broader lesson here, and this is the doctrinal verdict I want every viewer to carry away from this analysis, is that modern warfare has rewritten what isolation means. Isolation no longer requires encirclement. Isolation no longer requires the seizure of every road. Isolation now means the imposition of unacceptable uncertainty on every logistical movement. It means making the enemy's rear unsafe enough that the enemy cannot plan operations beyond a few days of guaranteed supply. By that definition, the Russian Crimea group of forces is already isolated. They are sitting on a peninsula with a degraded bridge, a contested land corridor, and a maritime route that Russia's own navy cannot use without losses. They have not been overrun. They have been logistically suffocated in slow motion. And once that suffocation reaches a particular threshold, which I assess we are at or near, based on the gasoline rationing, the locomotive losses, the ferry losses, and the bomber losses, the political shock of admitting it will be catastrophic for Putin personally, because Crimea was the founding myth of his entire third presidency. History will record that the war for Crimea was not won by amphibious assault or by a dramatic ground offensive across the Perekop Isthmus. It was won by a patient, asymmetric, 18-month logistics campaign in which a country without a navy denied a peninsula to a country with one, in which cheap drones and underwater charges and surface boats progressively rendered impossible the supply of a force that was supposed to be unassailable. That is the verdict. That is the case study. That is the structural failure that Russian military culture has not yet been honest enough with itself to confront, and the doctrinal adaptation that the Ukrainian armed forces have demonstrated with a level of rigor that the world's serious militaries are now studying in their staff colleges, whether they say so publicly or not. There are open questions. I will not pretend otherwise. We do not yet know how Russia will respond to the slow collapse of its Crimean logistical envelope. We do not yet know whether the Russian General Staff will eventually order the quiet evacuation of materiel from the peninsula in anticipation of a future Ukrainian land offensive, or whether political pressure will force them to keep the forces in place until the situation deteriorates further. We do not yet know what the next Ukrainian strike on the bridge will look like, or whether the bridge will be struck in conjunction with a broader campaign against the Azov ferries and the Kerch railhead in a way that forces a genuine logistical crisis within a single quarter. Those questions do not have simple answers, but they are the right questions. And they are the questions that will define the next phase of this war, far more than the headline movements on the Donetsk front that mainstream coverage continues to focus on. Stay with me on this channel, because this is the analysis you will not get from the cable news cycle and you will not get from the wire services. We are tracking the strategic and doctrinal shifts that determine who actually wins this war beneath the noise of daily battlefield reports. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of why the Kerch Bridge story matters at the level it actually matters, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. We are building toward a goal that lets us produce more of this depth of analysis more often, and every subscription pushes that further. Stay with us. The next update is coming because the next phase of this campaign is already underway, and when the threshold finally breaks, you will want to have seen it coming.